Determined budget is a process of aggregating all of the estimated costs of individual activities or work packages to establish an authorized cost baseline. The primary output from this process is our cost baseline. Inputs to this process include our project management plan, and we want to look specifically at our resource management plan. This is going to have information of how much we're going to have to pay our resources. As we talk about our human capital, perhaps hourly rates, perhaps salary, potential travel costs, any training needs that they may have that need to be satisfied. And also the recognition plan. Perhaps there's things along the lines of safety awards. We might also have to go ahead and look at the cost of heavy machinery, equipment, tools, raw material, or anything else that we need to purchase for the project for these individual activities. All of these costs must be taken into consideration to create a viable project budget. This is obviously discussed more in the plan resource management process. Our project documentation as we look at our risk register. The risk register will have our identified risks, and for any risk event that we have selected a response strategy for that calls for the application of contingency reserves, we need to look at how much contingency reserve will we actually need, because here we need to go ahead and plug that money in. The tools and techniques that we're going to use in this process include our cost aggregation, which is how we are going to roll up the cost through each level of the WBS. We will actually see this in action on the next slide. Historical information review allows us to compare a past similar project to what we're currently doing. Obviously, we want something as recent and relevant as possible. We can use parametric or analogous estimation models based on that past experience to not only predict total project costs, but also perhaps when we're going to need those incremental cash disbursements. The funding limit reconciliation is basically what we're looking at is fiscal years and fiscal quarters. We have set amounts of funding for certain periods of time. Obviously, we have a certain amount of work that we're also trying to finish in that period of time. If we run out of money during one of these periods, we may need to reschedule work to the next period. However, if we are incredibly efficient and we have money left over during a period but run out of work, then we might reschedule work from the next quarter into this one. When we talk about financing, typically this is money coming from outside of our organization. When we see this in very large scale projects, think about especially small townships, how they will float a bond to perhaps renovate a school or build a new track or whatever else it may be. Now, when you take money from another organization, you obviously are introducing further stakeholders, and that funding entity may impose additional requirements on the project. Cost aggregation starts with our individual activity estimates. How much does it cost to complete the work of each activity? Above this, we have our activity contingency reserves. If we've identified risk that is inherent to the type of work that we're doing with that activity, then we can go ahead and sometimes set aside money to deal with that. For example, if we're getting ready to build a shed in our backyard and we've identified that we need perhaps 28 2x4s, purchasing exactly 28 may necessitate driving back to the store at some point because it'd be reasonable to expect that at least one would be cut incorrectly. This is just basically assuming that life happens and we were going to set aside money to purchase a little bit extra. Now, how much extra might we purchase? Maybe 5%, maybe 10%, whatever we deem to be appropriate within our project. These numbers will be aggregated into our work packages. These work package estimates will be taken with our contingency reserves, which are for known unknowns or identified risk. These are risk events that have been documented on our risk register and for which we've decided that a risk response strategy of applying contingency reserves could somehow deal with that. So let's use an example of inclement weather and a construction project. If we lose 2 days of work due to a severe thunderstorm, we could go ahead and put some money aside to pay for overtime to try and get back on track. So right there, we can see an example of how a contingency reserve can deal with an issue that we have identified that could possibly happen. These numbers will be aggregated into our control accounts. All of our control accounts will then be aggregated to create our cost baseline. The cost baseline is controlled by the project manager. This is how we will measure our performance on the project. Above the cost baseline is our management reserves. Management reserves are for unknown unknowns. These are for unidentified risks. So these are not on the risk register or sometimes for risk events that were on the risk register but happened with a far higher impact than anybody could have reasonably foreseen. I used an example before of inclement weather delaying our construction project. Losing 2 days is something that could be reasonably expected, especially if it's the stormy season wherever we're building our house at. Now, if we get hit by a severe hurricane and we lose all utilities for, say, 90 days, could we look at the project manager and say, you should have seen this coming? Well, no, that's an unforeseeable risk event. There's no way that we could have figured out that this would be the impact. It would be that severe. In that type of situation, the application of management reserves would be appropriate. Now, since this is outside of our cost baseline, it is very important to note this is controlled by somebody above the project manager's level. The PMBOK does not say exactly who. It may be the sponsor, it could be the project management office, it could be senior management within the organization. Suffice it to say, your boss. For exam purposes, it's always going to be somebody above the PM. The cost baseline and management reserves will be aggregated to create the total project budget. This is all of the funding that is set aside by the organization to complete this project's work. Outputs from this process include our cost baseline. So the cost baseline is an authorized, time-phased project budget, but this excludes any of those management reserves that we were discussing on the previous slide. Again, the reason being is not controlled by you. We can only measure our performance against the funds that we control. So with the cost baseline, we can measure, monitor, and control the cost performance of the project. The cost baseline appears as an S-curve on a graph. Some people might think that the name S-curve is a bit of a misnomer. However, it really does make a lot of sense. So within this graph, we're looking at cumulative expenditure of funds over time. So on the vertical axis, we're looking at the amount of money that we've spent, and horizontally, as we go to the right, it's always going to be the passage of time. So two things will always be true about this graph. The line will always go to the right because time will never reverse, and the line will always go up because we're always going to be spending money and we're not going to be getting any refunds. So in the beginning, where we have very small expenditures, it's a very, very narrow, very short, and it's almost horizontally moving forward over time. But that's going to be very sharp, going almost straight up at some points during execution as we're expending the majority of our funds. But that's going to kind of peter off at the end of the project as we start closing everything out. So you can kind of imagine it's almost like a sideways S in that regard. Our project funding requirements refers to the total and periodic amounts of money that we're going to need from the baseline. Funding typically occurs in incremental amounts. It's very rare for a project, unless it's very small or very short in duration, to receive all of the funding all at once. Typically, this funding will either occur, like we were saying before, quarterly, or in situations where we have some type of procurement activities, perhaps it's tied to some type of measurement of work completed or some type of milestones that have been reached. Our project documents updates include our risk register. Once we've assigned all of these reserves, we want to go ahead and document that yes, we have assigned these contingency reserves. Also our cost estimates and our project schedule. The project schedule, very specifically, because as we talked about with funding limit reconciliation, we may need to go ahead and reschedule work between quarters based upon the availability of funding. We just finished discussing the determined budget process. Do a quick learning assessment. What is the difference between this process and estimate costs? The estimate cost process, this is where we're looking at the cost of each activity. And the determined budget process is concerned more so with the aggregation. So we're rolling up all of these costs to the highest level, and then we're looking at how much money do we need for the project and when are we going to need it. Why is reserve analysis used again here? So there's two types of reserves that we're primarily going to see. We're going to see reserves for time and for money. And we're concerned primarily with the reserves for money, making sure that we have enough. How is historical information review helpful in this process? Historical information review can assist the project manager and the project management team to accurately predict the total project cost. Now, this is assuming that the underlying data is accurate and the parameters used are quantifiable and that the model is going to be scalable. So what's the difference between contingency reserves and management reserves? Contingency reserves are set aside for known unknowns or identified risk. These are risk events that are on the risk register and for which we have selected a risk response strategy that calls for the application of contingency reserves. Management reserves are for unknown unknowns. These are for unidentified risks. These are for unforeseeable risks that nobody could reasonably have been expected to have foreseen. Explain the difference between the cost baseline and project budget. The one difference between cost baseline and project budget is the presence or absence of management reserves. The cost baseline plus management reserves equals the project budget. The cost baseline is all of the money that the project manager controls. When we add the management reserves, which is outside of our control, then we have the project budget, which is all of the money the organization has authorized for the project. What types of project documents might be updated after you perform this process? We could be updating the risk register, our activity cost estimates, our project schedule, and also our funding source documentation.